Life is suffering. Love is the desire to see unnecessary suffering ameliorated. Truth is the handmaiden of love. Dialogue is the pathway to truth. Humility is recognition of personal insufficiency and the willingness to learn. To learn is to die voluntarily and be born again in great ways and small. So speech must be untrammeled, so that dialogue can take place, so that we can all humbly learn, so that truth can serve love, so that suffering can be ameliorated. Jordan Peterson.
Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Mentality. It's your boy Gambo, and today I have a special guest with me, Officer David. We're going to be discussing bridging the gap between black and brown communities with law enforcement. What are some of the challenges that exist? Why do they exist in the first place? And what are the things that we can do to help better that situation as a whole? Stay tuned as we chop it up in another interesting episode. All right, welcome back to the show, guys. I'm here today with David, who is a Virginia City police officer who has been in the service for about 2 years now. And David is someone that I've had personal conversations with. We actually met on a forum, on an online forum, not online, but pretty much in video forum, where we had discussions about police brutality, defunding the police, and a slew of discussions that lasted for about 8 hours. And that was from like 6 p.m. at night all the way to like, I don't know, it's like maybe like 2 a.m. in the morning. So someone who I think is passionate about the work that he does and is passionate about having these kind of discussions to bridge the gap between disenfranchised communities such as the black and brown communities with the law enforcement community. So hopefully we are able to understand and gain a better resolve in the friction that has been had. So David, how you feeling today, man? It's good to have you on the show.
Dude, I'm pumped to be here. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to hang out and chat. So thanks, man.
Yeah, man, of course. So, man, like I think this is a very interesting topic. I think we don't talk about this enough. And to even approach a discussion like this, I honestly don't even really know where to start. But as a law enforcement officer, what do you think the current climate is? How do you perceive the current climate between black and brown communities and law enforcement communities? I mean, I think there's obviously a rift, but like, where do you think that rift is coming from?
That alone could be the question we could stick with and pretty much talk for hours.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot that goes behind it, but honestly, I think there's two different kinds of things going on. You actually kind of have a divide between those who, regardless of their race, may or may not even have interactions with the police in general and how they view the police. And then you have communities that do have very regular interactions with law enforcement, and each one has difficulties that are both separate and together, if that makes sense. I think a lot of it can be traced back to some historical stuff. There can't be any denying of that. But there's also an element of individuals who have had, whether good or bad, an experience with law enforcement. And I try and explain to people, just like as a really baseline, a lot of people have been stopped by the police, whether or not you're in some crazy prestigious neighborhood or a neighborhood that's got a lot of different financial struggles and different things going on. When you get pulled over, you're starting off your encounter with that officer or deputy or whatever. You're starting off your interaction with that other human being saying you've done something wrong.
Right.
So you're already on an uphill battle, because when I pull you over, if assuming I'm doing my job properly and I'm pulling you over for a reason, right? If we take that into account, we are basically, you have to almost earn that person's trust if they don't have that already and based on their own experiences. So it's a challenge, and every officer has to take on their style of policing, how they encounter individuals, how they encounter people, depending on the calls and depending on the particulars of those situations. I think it takes one officer to ruin 100 officers' hard work. It's similar to, honestly, any type of situation. Like if you look at a company and maybe they have an instance of, like sexual harassment or something that might become very public, it can take one person to destroy something that might have been, even if it was a lot of it's flawed and a lot of it's messed up, but there's a decent amount of good that was coming from it. It can pretty much just be tarnished in a day. It doesn't take a whole lot to ruin good things. And so there's so many different challenges that come with it. I like to try and take an individual look at these things. And it's a hard question, but I would have to, talk to a specific person and have a conversation about their experiences and about what's gone on in their life. But yeah, generally speaking, I don't know, just to frame it, to understand the whole thing is it's key to understand that, a lot of times something so basic like a traffic stop, because you rolled a stop sign, or you got a tag light out, something really basic. You're starting on the foot of, hey, you've done something wrong. I'm here to address that. And a lot of people, myself included, don't like being told that we've done something wrong, or that maybe we violated something or whatever, no matter how petty it is. Essentially, part of the divide that I think we find ourselves in is a combination of bad policing, misinformation. There's a lot of historical background that, police officers are doing something. It's very challenging in the sense that they are, they have the authority to arrest. They have the authority to do certain things that other people can't. And at the same time, we know that, they're human too. They put their pants on the same way, one leg at a time. So overall, there's a lot to be said about it. But yeah, I don't know. That's kind of my general thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I feel like you touched on a lot of things that I honestly can't touch on every single point. But you said something I thought was interesting, is that when a police officer pulls you over, like you're pretty much at the point where you felt like, okay, this is already an issue because, I've done something wrong. So there's automatically that rift. And that's from both sides. Like, for example, from the police officer's perspective, I would imagine that, like, well, okay, now I have to deal with someone who feels like I'm going to like reprimand them for something they've done. And for the person who's being pulled over, they probably feel like, oh man, I'm about to be reprimanded. So I think there's always that conflict or that friction, if you will, right? From the get-go. And so that's incredibly difficult. But also, like, I just wanted to make sure that I clarify that I certainly don't expect you to speak on behalf of all cops, just as I can't speak on behalf of like all black and brown people. That's just never gonna happen. Experiences, I believe, are certainly different. The experience that I might have might be from my lens and perspective, could very much so differ from somebody else's perspective. And so, you know, when I ask you about these questions, I really do want your perspective, your true, honest point of view, as to where you think that divide is coming from. Like, I know you kind of mentioned the divide is coming from, like historical context, uh, police, just the nature of the job itself. But like, you think some of the conflict is also coming from certain individuals who are like just not trusting of the police. What do you say to that?
I know of people I've had conversations with that, at least in the time and place that I had those conversations, um, there wasn't an ounce of trust that they had with me,
Mm.
simply because of my position. And that's a really challenging place to be at. And there are those people. I think there's a lot more people that are willing to try and understand one another. It's why we're trying to have this conversation. I
Absolutely.
think I think social media is like, I've listened to a couple of the podcasts before, and um, I know at one point you guys were talking about social media, and a lot of what you guys were saying, and I don't know, I think you touched on it a lot of how it's got its, obviously social media is really good in a lot of ways, but I also think it's led to assisting in sort of dividing people.
Absolutely.
And, yeah. So,
It's an echo chamber. It's like media, right?
yeah. I mean, anything you do, you click on, it's recorded and they take that into account and then it builds your feed up to basically, be supposedly what you desire.
Right.
So, I mean, that's challenging for anyone. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, when you work, you come across people that are they just have different temperaments than you, different responses, different styles of living their lives. And that's, I think, what would be the right word? Exaggerated when it comes to law enforcement. I think because police there's severe consequences. I mean, that's what police are. Where, I mean, they lead to severe consequences. I mean, being put in a prison is a severe consequence, or like worst case scenario, getting shot or something crazy like that is like that's the worst of the worst. You know what I mean? So there are consequences, and so it's gonna have a lot of emotion. A lot of people are gonna have different experiences. So
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that because I would think that, with the current, climate surrounding law enforcement I would say even starting 2014 is when the height of things really started for our generation. Like, what made you want to become a police officer? Knowing, that was kind of like, the climate that you might have to handle.
yeah, I joined in 2018, so I like just graduated um, from a college, and I went to kind of a process of figuring out what I wanted to do. And just like anybody else, when you're really young, you're not exactly sure. And so I was headed in one route, and it was supposed to be kind of in the medical field, and I always wanted to try and help people. I've just really, I think, I think it's really important to realize that life's not about you, and so because of that, and the reality that suffering exists, and that there are ways to try and alleviate that suffering. I kind of my senior year of college was like on the path to graduate, going to another school to do more further educating, stuff like that. And that's all well and good. But for me, I was like filling out applications. And as I was going through applications for different schools, the question was posed, why do you want to do this? And I started realizing I was making up the answers.
Mm.
Um, so that kind of led me back to my roots, which was, I think, as a little kid, I grew up sort of close to New York City, not crazy close, but close enough to be a fan of New York, and so I ended up wanting to be NYPD cop, classic
Mhm.
movies and all the costumes and stuff like that. But I just started being like, okay, like I want to be on the front lines. I want to come in contact with people who are having their worst day and try my best to alleviate the situation. As I'm not going to come into someone's 15 years of marriage and they're having some domestic dispute and I've never been to their house before and I don't know them. But I'm going to try,
Right.
because
Yeah.
I'm not going to sit back and accept a position where I ignore that, and I want my life to be dedicated to that. So
Interesting, man. Okay. So it wasn't the traditional, I want to help. And I appreciate you for being honest about that because I think a lot of times when you ask cops or people who are in the service industry, they're just like, well, I just, always wanted to help people and this and that and the third. But I mean, that's a different perspective that I think is interesting too. Um, but kind of like going back to the main topic at hand, I really wanted to have this conversation. Obviously, not to focus on the divide, which I feel like, you even mentioned we could talk hours and hours and hours on that,
oh yeah,
which we have before, obviously. So I want to really focus on like, where we can kind of bridge the gap.
yeah,
Where can we help, alleviate some of these pain points, some of these stresses, and to help ease in the friction between these two communities that clearly and blatantly exist. I was hoping you could share a couple tips with us, a couple thoughts that you might have that from a lens of a police officer And hopefully maybe I'll be able to share a couple things too that I think you could benefit from. And that'll be a win-win for everybody, hopefully.
Heck yeah, let's do it. So this is not an exhaustive list. There are more things to add, but some fundamental things that I thought would help law enforcement and then therefore help the communities they serve. And then I also made a list of things that I think would be like productive for citizens to work on. Obviously, I'm a citizen too, so it's things that, if you're not involved in law enforcement, which most people aren't, what are some things that might be able to assist? So the first one that I put is something that I think goes to the idea of police officers are supposed to be role models, and your appearance does make a difference. And so not only does your appearance, but even more importantly, how well you can function physically. And so I think a lot of departments are lacking the fitness requirements post graduation of the academy. We don't take care of ourselves. How are you expected to make really difficult decisions, sprint, run, chase, whatever you want to call it, do all these different things, and then, the person is grabbing around their waistband, or they're yelling and turning towards you, and they have something in their hand. I mean, there's so many different variables, and so it's like, okay, if your fitness is lacking, then how is that going to help you with your breathing? How is that going to help you? Because when you're tired, you don't make good decisions. When you're exhausted, and that goes, physical fitness, that goes hand in hand with getting sleep and taking care of your body and eating right. Some of that can't be, mandated necessarily, but I think there's a lot of officers out there that they struggle with that. I mean, I'm sure that there's people who struggle with health and fitness stuff where you work. You know what I mean?
Right. So to clarify, are you basically saying that your physical appearance and your functionality or health and fitness as a police officer is important because it's almost detrimental to the types of decisions that you make? So, for example, and this is an extreme example, but in the event that, somebody might be running away from you and then you're tired, as opposed to you being able to like grab them and like, cuff them,
Right.
you end up like pulling a taser, you end up pulling like a gun because it's like closer.
Yeah.
It's easier for you to kind of like, you think, you
Yeah.
don't really think,
Yeah.
but it's like,
No, for sure.
okay, I
Yeah.
see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are moments when that could play a role in de-escalating things, So,
I think
uh,
definitely the mindset first, but I can certainly see how like the muscle memory could kick in. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, that's just one thing.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so I mean, that's like a key thing to me is physical fitness. Of course, that means everyone who knows me, who listens to this, is going to be like, "Come on, man! I know when you you didn't work out or anything like that." But we're not all perfect. So these are some goals I have for myself too.
Yeah. Hey, I'm gonna hold you to that too.
um, I'll skip around a little bit, but I think something that I know for my department, I don't carry a taser. Um, and so something that would be really good, I think, would be ensuring that each officer is certified on the various non-lethal weapons and be able to have enough of those available to officers. I know I've been told the reason why I didn't get one yet is because they don't have the money for it. It's not in the budget. And so that's a challenge. It's one more tool I could have, you know what I mean, before anything else can be escalated.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's interesting too to hear, like from a budget perspective. And I feel like maybe I don't know how big the town you serve is, but I feel like obviously one of the biggest conversations, and I'm not at all trying to get into this, is
Sure.
like funding for police officers and how high it is and how people want to defund it. But I think that's interesting to hear, like from your perspective and from your specific, city, it's like not exactly I would have thought. So that's interesting for me to hear. I also just want to like say if we can possibly like kind of like rattle off like these points and kind of delve into the ones that we find the
Okay.
most interesting would be
Yeah.
awesome.
Heck yeah. All right. So I got the first one is maintaining a fitness standard post academy, more consistent defensive tactics training post academy provided, more consistent firearms training post academy provided, more consistent scenario based training post academy provided, ensuring each law enforcement officer is certified on various non-lethal weapon systems, ensuring there is enough non-lethal equipment for each law enforcement officer, ensuring there is enough ammunition for law enforcement officers to become proficient with their duty weapons, ensure equipment is updated, better incentivize young officers into making a career with the department, increase the advertisement of ride-alongs within their citizenry. And that's the law enforcement side of it.
Okay, so like just listening to that, like from like from like numbers 2 to 7, I think sounds like to me like an umbrella under training. It sounds like these things could be categorized under training. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think training and access to resources. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I think one of the main things you said, I think it was like number 8 or number 9, or both 8 and 9 sounded like more like resources. For sure, like 2 and 3 definitely sounded more like kind of like training. So it's like,
Yeah,
can
definitely.
you delve into that? Like, what do you think is a lack thereof, and how can that be improved on specific?
Yeah, so like you were saying before, I can't speak for every police
Yeah.
officer. I know with my academy, um, it was about 7 months long, and we had defensive tactics, and we had firearms training. But once the academy's over, you don't really get that a whole lot. Um, and when I say you don't get it a whole lot, I mean we get annual firearms qualifications, and then we do some defensive tactics trainings and some scenarios, um, in in days that are designated during the year, and that's usually 2 to 3 days in 365 days. So when you're doing a job, or I guess one way I saw this Navy SEAL talking about how they do their training and their deployments, and so he was talking about how they trained for like a year and a half to do a deployment that's 6 months. And so, not saying that that's how it needs to be for law enforcement, but I do think that your average patrol officer who's going to 911 calls, the ones that usually you see out and about when you're driving around, I think it'd be really, really useful to have officers be able to spend time, on the mats to understand how to control someone safely, how to maintain composure, because it wasn't really until when you're in the academy, one of the things they keep telling you is like, never give up, never give up, never give up. But it gets increasingly more difficult when you get tired and you start to lose form and you start to lose your skills that they've tried to drill into you.
Yeah.
And so if I've been an officer for 10 years, unless I've paid for it, I've had less than 3 or 4 weeks worth of training in total for 10 years. I mean,
Pretty
it's kind of
minuscule.
crazy.
Yeah. I mean, just quick question: were you referring to Jocko? When you were saying
Yeah.
that? Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah.
I figured you were. So like I've heard the comparisons, like people drawing parallels between law enforcement, Navy or Army or military. I always am like really a little wary of that because I'm like their jobs are very different. But I do think there's some truth to what you're saying though, because unfortunately, like it would seem that the military has a lot much more success in their dealings than I would say law enforcement. That's not a knock to law enforcement.
Yeah, I hear you.
That's just, like the perceived from my angle. That's like the perception. But I think that's interesting. I also wanted to kind of like talk about like not even just I think what you said is true, like being comfortable in uncomfortable situations with like physical things that might happen as a police officer is gonna happen. But even like the social work of it, because my understanding, you can please correct me if I'm wrong. I think like police officers typically end up having to do like a lot of social work. I don't know if there's enough. Do you think there's adequate training on like social interactions or maybe the way we handle that? Or do you think there needs to be more training on that as well?
Yeah. So when it comes to the military and the connection to law enforcement, the only where I draw that connection is I do understand the sentiment of like being weary of that, because I'm definitely not saying they're the same thing. We're
Right.
not trying to do the exact same job. It's obvious. And so the way I look at it is, if you can create an individual, ideally during the hiring process is when you're finding an individual that it suits the needs that you're expecting for the job.
Right.
Some of that gets, some of the stuff that's not going to be sufficient for the job gets weeded out during the academy. Some of
Sure.
it, some
Yeah.
of it, just naturally happens. But I see it as very much as, if you're capable of doing something dangerous, but able to have self control and restraint, then you're that much of a better human being, if that makes sense.
No, I totally agree with that. Yeah.
And so that's kind of like where I draw that connection. But yeah, in regards to like social work and stuff, I have obviously been in lots of different situations where most of, in fact, not even just lots of situations, most of my job is talking to people. I mean, it's pretty much what you do. You just constantly are talking to people, and so I think that we could use, depending on how the department's structured, could use some assistance in, you know, doing more de-escalation stuff.
Mm.
But I think that goes back to the idea of relooking at how we do our annual training. Because at least in my academy, we did a lot of talking and a lot of figuring stuff out. I mean, most of my academy wasn't like figuring out how to like handcuff someone. Most of my academy was talking about law, was physical fitness stuff, and was basically like scenario, scenario, scenario. I mean, we didn't do any sort of like ground fighting tactics or figuring out how to like restrain people until like a few months in, and it was very limited, very small baby steps. They act like you've never done it before, which is the way they should. The social worker mindset too is obviously essential, because we don't want to be hiring people who think that bullying people is the best way to a successful, healthy, vibrant community. So I think there's room for it. I just don't know what it looks like without. I think some of it is the people we need to be hiring need to be like. I mean, there's a reason why they say stuff like NYPD, like New York's finest. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I think that there should be a standard that is. I mean, generally speaking, I've never come across like an awkward cop, if that makes sense, like a
Mhm.
socially awkward cop. Now, there are, I'm sure, out there, but generally speaking, like, you should be a articulated person that you should be able to have a conversation with someone.
Mhm.
I mean, literally, like during the day, I talk to people who don't look anything like, have totally different experiences than me,
Right.
and like there I am, just like sitting on the corner of the street, and I'm just having this chat with this random guy, and then I talk about his shoes, and then like bring up something else random because I'm just trying to keep the conversation
Right.
going, whatever it is. Um, but yeah, I just don't know what it would look like. I don't know. Do you have something in mind for like what you think that social work type of aspect that police officers do pretty regularly? What that would look like?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think it's tough because one, I think in order for me to be able to have that much level of insight, I'll probably have more insight to what police officers do in terms of that realm. I do have the only experience I have with that really is either my dealings with police officers, or I remember one time I was in high school and I ended up being in this, it was like a shop. It was like an after school curricular thing that we did. And it was criminal justice. And I'll never forget. So we had the police officer at the school who I was kind of like, I built a relationship with, was telling us about like how to get in law enforcement, what they had to do, and if they met people, what kind of stuff that they would do. And that's kind of where I found out that a lot of the interactions actually were from police officers are like typically with people who are like domestic stuff. It's like just like you like stopping people from arguing and like knocking on people's doors, and it's not the door busting type stuff that we always see on TV. So I learned a lot from that. And so I think you're right. I think the threshold or the level of professionalism you should have as a police officer, not even just professionalism, the level of character you should have, I think should really be high. And I really personally think police officers need to be like highly skilled, highly trained people that get paid very well. Like it shouldn't be like a job that's like easy, because it's not. Like I feel like you have to, and I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong. I just feel like you have to make like split second decisions. You have to really be able to analyze and strategize and look at things and, make the best informed decisions. Because, like you said before, there are consequences when you do not do these things. And clearly we've seen some of that. So I would agree with you on that. And I would say, in terms of like implementing a solution, it would have to come from, legislature, either making sure that we are mandating that, police officers need to get more training in that arena, and maybe even hiring people who have social work and backgrounds in police and law enforcement. And so maybe if there's someone who's attempting suicide, we're not dispatching someone whose strength is in combat. You know what I mean? It should be like somebody who could do more of that de-escalation work. But again, I don't know the practicality of it. I don't know how pragmatic that might be. But like in an ideal world, that's what I would think. Like, that's who you would send. So I guess that would be
Right.
like, my answer.
No, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and dude, it's crazy. Like you're right, and then at the same time, it's like when I talk like this, I don't want to be disrespectful to the fact that so many of these things that officers do that they really like were, done basically overworked, you know, too much on your plate type thing.
Mhm.
You know, so much of that is still done successfully. And so the whole like I've been to many suicidal people like calling 911 or someone else
Mhm.
calling 911. And it really ranges, it ranges from the person calling who is saying, "Hey, I have suicidal thoughts." And I mean, more times than not, honestly, I this is more of a kind of a guess on my estimate on in estimating the percentage of calls, but I would say when it comes to suicidal calls or suicidal subject calls, that probably 70%, 75% of them, it's the person who's suicidal calling. And, there are hotlines, there are places for them to call, but when the person says, I'm planning on doing this, I have X, Y, and Z planned, I'm going to do this, they will then call us. Like I've had it where a person is texting a hotline and then they call us. So the hotline calls us. And most of the time it's them literally just saying, "Hey, I don't feel well. I'm not feeling I'm feeling like hurting myself. Can you please take me to the hospital?" And so most of the time we take them and not the medics, not the fire department. And we don't for us, for where we're at, we don't our policy is not to handcuff them if they're voluntary. And so, it's basically a ride. You get a ride to the hospital. And so, yeah, it's really like I want to say like, yeah, we need more training. And at the same time, I don't want to be like, man, we're just totally reckless. We got no idea what we're doing. We're in over our head. Like that's also too far. And I saw I don't know, have you heard of Bloomberg, Indiana, with like social workers and stuff and police.
No.
So a small, well, I wouldn't say small, a town full of 85,000 people, which is decent. I guess they implemented this thing in March of 2019, and they said that they needed to have some social worker in their department, and so it's not for the officers, but the idea would be that they will not necessarily ride with the police, but they will like have separate cars. And if I go to a domestic or something,
Mhm.
and it's between a husband and a wife, and let's say the husband goes to jail for domestic assault, it wouldn't be that part changes. It wouldn't be that the law changes for that, but that then afterwards, when it's safe, the social worker goes in and speaks with the victim or speaks with the offender in a like when the person's in a safe place and they're not gonna, physically, potentially physically attack like the social worker or something. And I saw that, and I was trying to read up on like at the time of the article, it was new, the implementation of it. So, knowing what the consequences of that and how that helps or doesn't help in alleviating some of the issues. And I think the chief was basically saying like he's not reducing the amount of officers he has because it's already a struggle to keep up with the amount of calls we have.
Mhm.
But the idea would be that maybe by addressing some of these things where a social worker can connect people, that's what social workers do. They don't necessarily always, solve the problem, but they do lead people to different programs in different, sometimes different housing, whatever it may be. And so they they use this where, okay, police still do their job, but the social worker is there right away. Instead of it being, I go to this domestic, I take care of business, I have to do what I have to do. I have to arrest this guy because he beat his wife up. And he goes to jail, and then that's it. I mean, that's what happens. Then a detective maybe follows up with them. I know for where I'm at, they have this system where we ask the victim questions specifically for domestics, and ask them 20 questions, yes or no, and based on that, we can tell, or at least it's the idea is that we'd be able to tell for future encounters that this person is at a high risk for domestic violence or at a low risk for domestic violence, that type of thing.
Okay.
So yeah, I don't know. Bloomberg, Indiana, should look them up.
All right.
It's pretty interesting. I don't know. That's something I think that could be useful. A lot of people don't want to do the whole. I don't want to see social workers have to run into a situation that could get ugly. But I do think that instead of just leaving people as victims or leaving people even as like offenders or perpetrators, sometimes it could be very useful to have a social worker maybe right there on scene, to assist with things. So
Yeah, man. So I mean, I definitely hear what you're saying, and I would say it makes sense. Um, I agree uh, with like a lot of stuff you said. I don't necessarily think we see eye to eye on all of it because, well, maybe also I think there's maybe more clarification that needs to be made on my end. Is that when I mentioned the social worker aspect, I don't necessarily expect social workers to be present, or replacing police officers. I think maybe hiring police officers should encompass someone with a social worker background. So they should still get police officer training and should still be equipped or adequate enough to be able to do the police officer job. You know what I mean? And also, like I think we mentioned earlier, is about I think you mentioned something that I thought was pretty interesting, which was honest. Is like you don't want to say that well we need training because then that you don't want to say that we need too much training because then that might indicate that like well we're just like totally reckless and we don't do our job. Whereas like for a lot of times it is positive. So I see that, but I think those two things should not be like mutually exclusive. Like you know what I mean? Like you could still be good at your job and still be able to be better is my point. So like I think yes, for some departments like their error rate, if you want to call it that, is probably really low. But that doesn't mean that we still can't like try to get to the best margin of error that we can get to. So like I think maybe implementing training until we're at 100% to me and anything that you do in life. I think you can still grow. And I think that's kind of where I'm like approaching that conversation from, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
yeah, that makes
Um
sense.
where the one thing I know that like you and I thought like was really interesting that you mentioned to me before, which I really need to do once COVID is all over, which could be forever, but as you mentioned ride-alongs, like point number 10. I thought that was like really profound. Like, can you please touch on that some more and like how exactly that like helps, citizens? Because I feel like a lot of things we talked about before kind of were like talking about things that cops should do, but like something like a ride-along, I never even considered that. And like, so how does that help citizens or civilians, I think you said, like, how does that help us like make better informed decisions? How does that help us just see both ends of the aisle? Like how does that help?
I think it's like basically you get to sit in my office all day
Mm.
and see, So I also think there's a problem with the lack of advertisement for it from departments. It's not like really pushed a
Why do you
whole
think?
lot. It's just not a priority, I don't think. I just don't think it's valued very much. And I think if that's really the perception, if my perception of that perception is right, then it's wrong, I think. But yeah, dude, ride along. Go to whatever department you like, whatever jurisdiction, wherever you live at, and look up the city or county or whatever department, and then usually there's like a section for citizens, whether it's like making a report or whatever. But also tends to be a spot where you can sign up for a ride along. Some police departments are technologically impaired, so it might be difficult, but you can also email or call them. And all that sounds like maybe like, I don't know, like call your congressman, email your congressman, like old people stuff.
Yeah.
But it's honestly just like a really good way to learn. I mean, like, you want to be an informed person, learn what your emergency services do by spending a whole day with them. I mean, you get to see kind of what happens.
So can you like touch more on like what does it consist of? Like what exactly is ride along for those who might not know?
So a ride along is you come to the police department, you meet up with an officer that's on patrol that answers 911 calls, and you sit right alongside him. You literally get in the car with a cop, and you do whatever they do that day. You follow them around, you go call to call. If they do a traffic stop, you're with them. Every officer might have a different rule about, like, where they want you to be, how they want you to participate or not participate. But generally speaking, you're there for the 8, 10, or 12-hour shift. So you kind of get to see how the inner workings. So it's pretty interesting. I think it kind of is able to sometimes strip people of their preconceptions of what's going to happen, or how certain things are handled. So yeah.
I mean, I think that's profound right there, man. I would say I think there's definitely just listening and hearing about that. It sounds like there's like immense benefit from it, for me at least. And again, I think it's always important that whenever we're talking about these things, we don't speak on behalf of. I can't speak on behalf of all Black and brown communities, just like I know you can't speak on behalf of all police, all law enforcement officers. So I think it's always important to clarify that. But for me, I think that would be something that would be interesting to kind of like experience and kind of get the idea of like see through the lens of somebody else and like what they go through and stuff like that. I will say this, and I know this might be funny. I wish like there was like an opposite program where you could do like a quote unquote ride along in certain neighborhoods, like go through the hood for like a day or two. Like, seriously, because I think it really, and not go as a cop, but like go as someone who's in it. Like, I think would be very eye opening. So yeah, I definitely got to check that out and appreciate.
I know. I've said this type of thing before. I mean, like, you can't swap skins with people. You can't exactly be in another person's shoes. But, with this whole craziness and stuff going on, if you want to, try and learn something about, maybe an area of life that you're maybe not completely well versed in, why not find out what your emergency services do, So I try and encourage people to do that. I did a couple ride-alongs before I was a cop myself. So
nice. What was that experience like? What did it teach you?
Well, I mean, it shows. I mean, first of all, like, you're always waiting for the chance to like drive fast and with your lights and sirens and all that stuff,
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, what I was watching, because at the time I was considering law enforcement, I was really just watching how the officer conducted himself. Like, I was just watching how he talked to people, how he did his investigations and stuff like that. So I learned that it's not all, awesome the whole time. And sometimes you're just like having a conversation with someone, and sometimes you got no idea what's going on and you're just trying to figure it out too. So yeah.
I once heard that it might be beneficial for any civilian whenever you move to a different neighborhood to just go into the police station and introduce yourself and say, hey, I'm Gambo. I just moved in here. I live on this street. just so they can kind of put a name to a face and understand who is supposed to be working for your neighborhood and who is serving you, and just to kind of like familiarize yourself with that staff as a whole. I think also helps alleviate some of those pain points. What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, heck yeah. I mean, the more you can learn about someone, the more you can sort of put yourself in their shoes a little bit, the better I think we all are.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say that you touch on a lot of things that I think are helpful. And I think we should have more conversations like this that, help bridge the gap as opposed to like heighten the differences. I think the differences are important. Don't get me wrong. We should talk about it. We should argue about it. We should have discussions about it. We should protest all of that. I'm a firm believer in that. And it be things that you and I might even talk about, even in this talk, we might not necessarily agree. And I think that's okay too, as long as we can respect one another and treat each other, more importantly, treat each other with humility and respect as human beings, I think is key. So thank you for being here, first of all. To always clarify is that, you're not necessarily speaking on behalf of all police officers. You're speaking on behalf of David, and I'm speaking on behalf of me, and I'm not speaking on behalf of every single black and brown person, because our experiences will be nuanced, coming from different perspectives. But yeah, man, so thank you for sharing some of the points and tips that you shared with us. How can people actually go ahead to sign up for a ride along?
Yeah. So if you go online to whatever department you live nearby, like if you live in a county or a city, there's usually a department that's supposed to be the police services there. You go online and find something. They usually have a part where they do ride-alongs, like forms, and you just got to fill that out and submit it to them. And after a few weeks, you can get back and they'll be able to schedule something and get you set up. So it's really important, I think, to understand how everything works, and it's something we don't even really think about. That's an option for us. So yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree. So this is online at what? Like you're just Google like local police department and then like
Yeah, literally just insert whatever city or town or whatever you live in.
Mhm.
And I recommend doing it at like the spot that you live at, and then also doing it in like a neighborhood or a city that you have a perception about, or a
Right.
bigger area.
That's a good point.
I think it just gives you more clues into what's going on in the world.
Yeah, man, that's super key right there, man. So thank you for sharing that. You have any other last words or anything like that, man? I mean, I feel like there's so much more we can talk about.
Dude,
But I
there's
don't wanna...
so much. I mean, last time we talked for so long.
Yeah.
I just want to say that this whole talk about police and stuff like that is so complex. We really, really have to try our best to put aside preconceived notions and attempt to have conversations with people. And I think that's just like talking, honestly, is going to be an essential point in our society, and it will drive people to find the truth. It'll drive people to find solutions, because when we stay within whatever group you find yourself in, um, I think we can miss a whole lot. And so you don't have to be Gandhi. You don't have to be like some big name person. You don't have to make the whole world know on social media that you care about something. Sometimes you just have to make your own personal life. Try to understand people, even not in this topic. But when it comes to law enforcement, so many things so many moving parts in different police encounters. And so I highly recommend just taking time, breathing, watching, seeing what happens is also a really good, important thing to do, instead of completely jumping on, with total emotion behind it, instead of trying to reason through some of the difficulties that are going on. And it's kind of a butchered way of saying, basically, try and critically think about some of these things before completely saying one side is this and one side is that. And that comes from, police officers need to do the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to touch on that more. I was going to say, I think the perception definitely goes both ways. And I mean, obviously, from my perspective, I would argue that more so goes, more negatively for black and brown people, because I think the way we're portrayed is just very, very, very terrible, very negative. But I do agree with you. I think it's important to have discussions to be able to see people with an open eye, and with an open heart and all that. See through their perspective, see from their lens. I think that's certainly important. But also, I think it's something we might not necessarily agree on. So I don't even want to harp on it. But I feel the need to mention it is that I think when it comes to like law enforcement, there are a lot of good people in law enforcement. But I think it's not just law enforcement as a whole. I think sometimes it's also the system. So I think we've had like long discussions about this, obviously. So
Yeah.
I'm not gonna harp on it, but I think like for example, I think you're a good dude, but I don't think that's necessarily gonna always translate into like law enforcement doing great work. And that's something like I feel like maybe for a different topic. Let's leave it at that.
Yeah, I got you.
Maybe we'll leave that for a different topic. But yeah, man, just definitely a pleasure to have you here talking about this. And I think it's good to start building solutions. And I'm all for solutions and not just talking about the problems, man. So thank you again for being here, David. It's really been a pleasure. For everybody who's tuned in, thank you so much for tuning in. We really appreciate y'all. We hope you can take anything that was said on here and implement at least one thing in your life, and hopefully be a part of that conversation, be a part of that catalyst, that change action to implement positive behavior throughout our country. As always, you can catch us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts on. Check us out on Instagram at Mentality Radio. And as always, we'll catch you on the next one. Deuces.